What are you doing here?
She doesn't want to talk to you.
Please just leave.
Rain battered the cafe windows so hard the reflections looked like they were crying. And the word that left his mouth landed with the crack of a dropped plate on tile. Handicapped. Before we begin this journey, take a breath with me. Look around your own life for a moment and subscribe. Because what happens next could change how you treat people. The Bluebird Cafe was a small miracle of warmth on a cold city night. Steam rose off mugs. Cutlery murmured. Strings from a soft jazz playlist threaded the air. At a corner table, a young woman in a simple red dress checked her phone for the 5th time in 20 minutes. She carefully adjusted discreet hearing aids that caught the light only when the pendant lamp swung. Hope lived in the way she straightened her back each time the door opened. Hope stalled, then thinned, then curdled into humiliation when the man finally sat across from her and frowned at those tiny glints behind her hair. He wore success like a pressed shirt. He belonged to pitch decks and heated boardrooms and award night selfies. He had a way of treating silence as a defect to be repaired. He thought he understood the world because the world kept letting him cut the line. He had a fixable flaw that he never bothered to fix. Status could make a person important, so people without it must be lest he pretended to read the menu while scanning her face. He mistook patience for weakness, calm for emptiness, technology at the ear for limitation. He kept thinking of the dinner reservations he'd canceled to be here, the messages from investors he hadn't answered, the big demo on Monday for a hospital contract his team needed. He wanted a date who could glide into those rooms with him. He wanted ease, not effort. He wanted to be admired without having to grow. The insult left his mouth like it had a right to exist. The red dress stiffened. Her fingers tightened around her water glass. The background murmurs fell away. 3 tables over, someone drew in a breath. Near the back, a little girl stopped coloring and missed a line of sky blue crayon across her paper sunset. Hands rose at the next table. A man, not much older than the one in the blazer, lifted his palms into the air and let them speak. It was deliberate, clear, beautiful. It said what every decent person in the room felt. It said, "You deserve better." The woman in the red dress blinked and looked at those hands like they were lifeboats. Her shoulders dropped 1 inch, then another. She inhaled. She exhaled. The man with the little girl signed again, slower this time, with a warm expression, and the little girl's grin arrived like a sunrise. The room changed. The restaurant manager faced the woman directly and put a comforting hand on the table. A kindness chain began, link by link. The man in the blazer stood anyway, the scrape of chair legs rough as his judgment, and tossed a final brittle line into the air. He turned, checked his reflection in the dark window, and left through the door with a gust of rain that didn't look earned. He walked to his car, coat flipping, face hot, pulse high with the strange thrill of certainty that he was the one who had been misled. He told himself he had standards. He told himself he had been tricked by a profile that used soft words. He told himself he didn't owe patience to anyone. He told himself a story that made him the hero. Across the street, a bus hissed to a stop and peeled away, leaving a spray that glittered under the streetlights. He leaned on the hood and opened his phone, ready to reclaim the evening with work. He didn't notice the window where the little girl returned to her coloring, whispering to her dad with her hands, or the way the woman in red finally smiled back. Shaky but real that he drove away, lining up emails like dominoes. In the rearview mirror, the cafe lights became tiny planets, receding. Morning arrived cruel and bright. He was at the co-working hub before most people had finished breakfast. His startup's name glowed from a frosted door, Pulse Loop. The team was building an appointment and patient messaging platform that promised efficiency for clinics and convenience for families. Efficiency had a way of swallowing empathy if no one guarded the line. He rarely noticed when it did. He moved through stand-up like a general. He approved the latest splash video full of happy families and bright doctors, and a quick flash of captions that didn't actually match the audio. He insisted demo speed mattered more than polish. He waved off the accessibility checklist his junior designer tried to hand him with the phrase that people like him default to when time looks more expensive than attention. Later has a way of becoming never until it becomes now. Mid-afternoon. The glass conference room filled with partners and their logo water bottles. The hospital liaison dialed in. The big contract hung in the air like a bonus check. He smiled into the camera and talked throughput and reduced no-shows and predictive reminders. He showed analytics with animated bars that rose like applause. He talked faster when the liaison asked about accommodations. He talked about tooltips and bigger fonts and a plan to add transcripts soon. Screen shared. A new face appeared. Calm, focused, clear eyes that held steady, hair pulled back, small silver behind each ear. He recognized her from a place in his body before his mind caught up. The room contracted. The air thinned. The woman in the red dress looked different under hospital lighting and professional clothes, backed by a wall of children's drawings and a sign that read Deaf Services. His teammate introduced her full title as if it were a gavel. Hospital Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services Coordinator. Pediatric Nurse by training. Community Liaison. Program Lead on Accessibility and Patient-Family Communication. Evaluator for technology adoption that would touch families like hers. The little screen felt suddenly larger than any stage he had ever managed to own. Every word he had said at the restaurant bloomed in his mind like an ugly caption he couldn't turn off. He reached instinctively for his throat to clear it and found there was nothing to clear. He had judged a stranger in front of witnesses. He had walked away proud of it. Now the stranger held the keys to the contract and, more importantly, the mirror he had been avoiding his whole life. She spoke in a steady rhythm and signed along so the interpreters in the room could rest. She asked how the platform would handle telehealth visits when both parties needed hands visible. She asked about ASR error rates for pediatric speech. She asked whether reminders would be sent as plain text so they could pass cleanly through screen readers, and if the color palette had been checked for contrast with real-world glare. She asked if he planned to build with the community or if he planned to build for them and assumed that was the same thing, that he had answers, but they were the wrong kind. They were answers built from convenience. He kept pausing. He kept glancing down. He kept seeing a little girl at a table, signing with joy. Blue crayon paused mid-sky. You deserve better was ringing in his ears, not as comfort, but as indictment. You deserve better became they deserve better. And the they included families his product would frustrate unless he changed it. The they included a woman he had diminished to protect his own ease. The they included a room full of engineers who needed leadership, not a glossy sprint past responsibility. The meeting ended with polite words and a promise to continue if he could demonstrate substantive changes. The screen went dark. The room went silent except for the humming HVAC and the whir of an espresso machine down the hall. He stood in that silence long enough to feel the weight of it. It didn't crush. It clarified. It didn't demand shame for its own sake. It demanded growth paired with cost. He tried to speak and felt the sentence fall apart. He dismissed the team and walked to the empty staircase because movement seemed like the only thing he could do that wasn't pretending. He climbed. He came down slower. Back at his desk, the email arrived with the subject line: no founder, no product lead, no ambitious person wants to see. The hospital had paused consideration until Pulse Loop could meet a clear set of accessibility requirements. There was an attachment. There was a thread of resources. There was a note at the end from the coordinator, simple and neutral, reminding him that families often give grace the first time they are included, that it is the second time you overlook them that tells the truth about your priorities. There are moments in a life when the mirror refuses to look away, and you either break it or fix what it shows. He closed his laptop because he wanted no more screens between him and responsibility. Asterisk. He left the co-working hub and walked 3 blocks to a community center he had driven past 100 times without really seeing it. A banner hung across the glass: sign language classes tonight. Inside, chairs formed a circle around a whiteboard where warm handwriting said, "Welcome. Hands are just another way hearts speak." The instructor had kind eyes that always faced whoever was talking so their lips could be read. The room filled with students who were there for reasons that made him feel small and hopeful at once. A grandmother who wanted to talk with her new grandson. A bus driver who kept missing stops for a deaf rider and wanted to fix it. A teenager who had fallen in love with someone whose world was quieter and richer than he knew how to enter. A construction foreman who figured safety started with understanding. He stayed late practicing the hand shapes for sorry until his fingers ached the way muscles ache when they are finally being used for what they were made for. He learned the sign for better, for learn, for together. He learned how facial expression carries meaning and how attention is a form of love. He learned how clumsy can be endearing when paired with humility. He stood at the back of the room while people packed up and saw the single dad from the cafe laughing with his daughter, their hands a dance. The little girl wore a dinosaur hoodie that flopped when she hopped. The dad caught his eye and, for a second, the stairwell silence returned. Then the man lifted a hand and offered a small nod. A simple bridge across last night's river. At home that night. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the quiet and practiced 3 truths with his hands until they felt less like performance and more like confession. I was wrong. I am learning. You deserve better. He went to bed with the tension of a person who has finally discovered the cost of his old story and the price of the new one. Morning again. He got to the office before the sun, turned off the big splash video, and gathered the team in a circle away from the screens. He told them they had missed the mark because he had drawn it badly. He told them they would rebuild the product with people who had not been in the room. He told them the schedule was about to slow and he would carry the weight of that choice. He told them he had a meeting to ask for help from someone he had heard, and that he would go whether she accepted his apology or not. He went to the hospital with a notebook and no pitch deck. He sat in the waiting area and watched the life of a children's clinic move like a concert. Tiny acts of care everywhere. Parents exhausted and fierce. Nurses who moved like choreographers. He thought about efficiency and how it should never outrun humanity. She walked toward him with a staff lanyard and professional poise that made the lobby feel like a classroom and a sanctuary at the same time. He stood and kept his hands visible because that was something he had learned already mattered. He signed hello. He signed may I speak with you. He signed I am sorry and watched his voice turn into motion that required his whole face and a steady breath that he told her, plainly and without excuse, what he had built inside himself that made last night possible. He told her that he had believed admiration proves worth and accommodation weakens it, and how wrong that had always been. He told her that he would understand if she chose not to help him fix the product, and that he would fix it anyway. He told her he had enrolled in classes, and that the first thing he learned is that language is community, not a feature. He told her he planned to fund interpreters for the clinic waiting room whether or not Pulse Loop ever set a line of code in this building. Again, that he placed a printout on the table because there are times when paper is more honest than a screen. It was a purchase order for a hearing loop system for the Bluebird Cafe, the cost circled, the note at the bottom in pen. This is mine to do because I am the one who damaged the air there. He had already called the manager. He had asked for a time to come after hours and install it with a volunteer crew from his team. He had volunteered to pay the staff overtime so no one's labor went unnoticed again. She listened. She watched his hands. She watched his effort to keep his voice quiet and his face expressive. She saw the purchase order and the fresh calluses on his fingers from a night of practice. She saw the difference between a press release apology and a life pivot. She nodded once and said they could begin with a listening session. She invited 2 parents, the single dad and his daughter, an interpreter, a speech therapist, a software engineer who happened to be deaf and brilliant, and 3 nurses who knew the chaos of clinic days. She said build with us or do not build at all. That room changed the product more than any accelerator ever had. They replaced fancy animations with clear contrast and spared bandwidth. They made every call caption first. They built a persistent chat for times when speech dropped or attention needed to split. They expanded preference settings so families could choose call length, modality, and how loud reminders arrived. They created a quick 1, 2, 3 setup video in sign and voice and text. They paid deaf testers, not in t-shirts and pizza, but in invoices that respected their expertise. He took the hits to the roadmap like a boxer learning that defense is as important as speed. He called investors and explained the delays. He lost 1, then 2, then a third. He sold the sports car he had bought to feel like a winner and used the cash to fund a pilot for schools that had been emailing the hospital for better telehealth tools. He kept showing up on Tuesday nights and learning more ways to move his hands like he meant it. He met the single dad and his daughter at a park where the community held a picnic that looked like a family reunion even for people who had never met before. He grilled. He washed dishes. He set up folding chairs. He learned the sign for dinosaur and kept making it wrong until the little girl laughed herself breathless and taught him again. He learned that humiliation can become compost if you let humility do its work. Thumbnail moment 1 lived in the difference between last night's flinch and today's welcome. A close-up of hands forming "You deserve." Better over a table where a woman in red lifted her chin and felt the world tilt back toward dignity. Thumbnail moment 2 bloomed in a conference room days later when the first deaf engineer they hired pushed a laptop forward and showed the team the screen reader, navigating the app like a river instead of a maze. And the whole room understood that beauty existed in clarity, not glow. Thumbnail moment 3 unfolded on stage at the community center when he stood in front of a full room with his hands shaking and signed an apology the way people deserve to receive one. Public when the harm was public, specific where the injury had names, and backed by receipts. The story tilted again the afternoon the hospital brought in a surprise evaluator. A woman with a cane, eyes like weathered oak, and the quiet authority of someone who knows the difference between lip service and labor. She lowered herself into the chair while everyone instinctively made room. She smiled without softness. The single dad introduced her as his mother. The little girl signed her grandmother's name with pride. The coordinator's face brightened, and, for the first time since the cafe, the man in the blazer felt like a person among people instead of an actor on a stage. The grandmother watched the product with attention that made everybody straighten. She asked about rural connectivity, about families who share one phone, about caregivers who work nights and nap days, about parents who are undocumented and afraid of any system, about interpreters who get double booked and end up sprinting across floors. She asked about small screens and big fingers and arthritic hands. She asked about the community hotline that needs a human who can sign, not a bot that can't. Then she turned, lifted her chin, and told a story that became the twist no one saw coming. Least of all the man who once used a word like a weapon. Years earlier, a young nurse new to pediatric med had made time for a scared child with progressive hearing loss and a father alone in a waiting room after a drunk driver didn't come home. She had called interpreters on her own dime when the system dragged its feet. She had shown a little girl that hearing aids were not shame, but tools. She had got the clinic to change signage and train staff. She had knitted tiny hats for babies with loop-friendly bands. She had written a grant that became a program. The coordinator lowered her gaze, and her smile turned private. The man who had left a woman in red alone in a storm understood that the person he had diminished at a table was the person who had changed the hospital he was trying to sell. He looked at his hands. He felt his face heat. He didn't speak. He didn't run. He let the truth arrive like rain on hot pavement, cooling a place pride had scorched. The grandmother lifted her cane and rested both palms on it, the way people do when they are about to close a circle. She told the room that the young nurse he had hurt with a cheap word was the one who wrote the scoring criteria for technology adoption in pediatric care across 3 clinics, and the one who had convinced state legislators to include accessibility in reimbursement metrics. She told him that if he had never said the word in the cafe, they might have passed him anyway and discovered later he didn't mean his promises. She told him last night might have saved the hospital from a betrayal by forcing him to grow before he got through the door. The meeting adjourned not with a gavel, but with nods that meant keep going, keep changing, keep paying forward. His life narrowed to the work of repair. He visited the Bluebird after hours with his team and installed the hearing loop into the floor, hands dirty, knees sore, the manager's eyes shining as she watched the screen on the tester light up. He paid for staff training out of his dwindling savings. He carried chairs and hauled cables and bought extra muffins for the opening morning when the small blue sign with a line through an ear went up by the door, promising a welcome that had never been there before. The first customer to test the loop was a grandfather who cried when the server's voice came into his hearing aids for the first time without a roar of background clatter. The man in the blazer stood 2 tables away and cried too, not because his name was on any plaque, but because for the first time the room was kinder because he had chosen to make it so. He took his mother to dinner there the next week and told her everything. She put down her fork and squeezed his hand and said he had always been a good boy who moved too fast to notice the flowers. She told him slowing down was not losing. It was learning to keep what mattered. He got an email from an investor who had left. The subject line was a single word, impressed. The body was short and careful. The investor's daughter, it turned out, had started losing her hearing this spring, and he had been clumsy and scared and looking for someone to blame. He had watched the apology video the community center posted. He had watched the Bluebird manager talk about the loop system. He had watched the hospital's update about the pilot program. He wanted back in, not because the numbers looked better, but because the founder did. The man in the blazer wrote back and said yes on one condition. The investor would fund a scholarship for training medical interpreters. With the first cohort named for a nurse who had changed a city, the hospital trial went live on a rainy Monday. The app loaded clean. The captions kept up. The reminders slid in as clear text. The support chat replied fast, with real humans, including one who signed on camera. Parents sent notes that read like prayers that he stood in the hallway and watched a little girl sign to her grandma while the pediatrician typed. He watched the coordinator step in and catch a small misunderstanding before it spiraled. He watched his team move like people who understood that product choices become life for families. He went home that night lighter than any exit from a party had ever made him feel. He pulled into his carport under a sky trying to clear. His phone buzzed out a link. A caption. A viral video of the cafe incident, recorded from a table he had never noticed. The clip began mid-sentence and ended before the hands had signed "You deserve better." The comments were lava. The hashtags were knives. The story was wrong without the middle and the ending. That's how the internet works when strangers become judges and context goes begging. That he scrolled to find his public apology. He scrolled to find the Bluebird's new sign. He scrolled to find the hospital's pilot and the grandmother's speech and the single dad's post where a dinosaur hoodie flopped and a little girl grinned. He looked for nuance and found only the algorithm's appetite. He got another buzz. A legal notice. Someone with a large following and a loud lawyer had filed a public discrimination complaint naming his company, arguing that the clip proved a hostile culture. The notice was real. The news would be fast. An investor texted a question mark. A board member emailed a calendar invite. The hospital liaison pinged him and asked if he was okay. He stood very still in the carport and listened to the rain begin again, softer this time, like a rehearsal for a storm. He breathed. He reached for his keys and dropped them. He picked them up and held them tight. The moral of his story had written itself already, and now it would be tested outside the gentle rooms where people root for growth. Do not judge by appearances. Verify before you vilify. Integrity is action when no one's watching, and it is also action when everyone is. That he wanted to run. He didn't. He turned, locked the car, and headed toward his door with a plan that tasted like metal and mercy. He would open his records. He would share receipts. He would invite the journalist to the Bluebird and show the loop. He would bring the lawyer to the community center and ask them to sit in a circle and watch hands say more than a clip could. He would face the hospital board with humility bordering on steel. He would keep listening because that was the only way this mattered. He reached the top step when the porch light flickered and went out. The phone buzzed again. A text from the coordinator with only 3 words and a meeting location that made his stomach lurch and his resolve flood back. "We stand together." He looked up into the dark, felt the night hold its breath, and knew this wasn't over. The first battle had been getting his pride to sit down. The second would be keeping the truth from being swallowed whole by the speed of outrage. A car rolled to a slow stop across the street. A figure got out and moved toward his driveway with a camera bag. Another shape lagged behind, a tripod cutting a silhouette against the streetlight. In the distance, sirens rose. Or maybe it was just the wind picking up as the storm finally arrived for real. He slid his phone into his pocket, flexed his fingers like a man about to speak a language that had taught him how to be new, and stepped forward into the shadows of part 2.